Okay, here's the final lecture of the course, and in this lecture I'm going to do what many political operatives and political pundits are doing right now, which is already looking ahead to the next election cycle, the next congressional election cycle, and the next presidential election cycle. Even though we still haven't gotten the final results, there's still counting being done. There are still congressional elections that are too close to call. There's obviously still the presidential election is over really, but it's Donald Trump isn't letting go of this. So the election's not even over yet, and already operatives and elected officials and party leaders and pundits and professors are looking ahead to 2022. And this is a natural thing. This happens every time. And the reason why this happens is because democracy is an ongoing process. And victory, while it's always the goal, is always temporary. And the real goal is to extend victories for as long as possible. Not simply to win a victory, but to extend victories as long as possible. So if you're not thinking about 2022 and 2024 in terms of the presidential election, 2022 for congressional elections, then you're really not engaged in politics in the way that people on the inside are really engaged in it. So I want to look at 2022. I don't really want to talk about the 2024 presidential election too much because it really, I'll mention a few things, but that one is really, I put that on the lecture title, but it's really kind of far enough over the horizon that it's really hard to say. The 2022 midterm elections, though, we know a few things. One, we know that the Democratic Party has a reduced majority, and we know that that's going to be the first midterm election in a Democratic presidential term. Historically, that means a loss of seats. And so what the Democratic Party is going to be looking to do is to try to hold off that historical pattern. Now, the 2020 election already kind of defied the historical pattern, which is that a victorious president tends to increase the number of seats in Congress for his or her party, and that didn't happen in this case, at least in the House of Representatives. One of the reasons why that didn't happen was that a lot of the seats that the Democrats won in the 2018 midterm elections, which was in a big way a Democratic push to make it a referendum on unified government under the Trump administration, was that a lot of those swing suburban districts that went against the Republicans in 2018 were brought back into the Republican side in 2020, even in places where Donald Trump didn't win. And there was a concerted effort, I think, on the part of the Republican Party to implicitly accept that Trump might not win re-election, and that the important thing for Republican voters to do, and for moderate voters who themselves don't necessarily lean strongly in one direction or the other, is to have checks and balances, to actually pitch the divided government message to voters, to say we're going to be better off with divided government because that's going to prevent the Democratic Party from running away with control of the legislative process. That's a true thing, but as a political message it can be tricky because there could be a lot of people who want the Democratic Party to run away with control for 2 to 4 years, just like a lot of people wanted the Republican Party to run away with control for 2 or 4 years after the 2016 election. But there was it was implicit, because you couldn't really piss off Donald Trump too much, but there was an implicit, well, if Trump loses and we kind of know he's headed down, let's have a bulwark against the Democratic majority. What also worked in a lot of those swing districts was that Republicans actually just ran on local issues and ran on their own name and their own merits, as opposed to tying themselves to the presidential candidate, which is not typical. But Donald Trump, created a lot of atypical political dynamics, and that was definitely one of them. And I would say that one of the things that helped the Republicans this particular time, that I think is probably making Democratic operatives less nervous than they might otherwise be, having faced a slippage in their House majority, is that Republican candidates engaged in the traditional face-to-face type of campaigning that is usually the most effective way to increase turnout. They went door knocking, they held rallies, they held in-person fundraisers. This kind of face-to-face politicking is always essential at every level of politics, from the smallest, where it's extremely important, right, city council level, all the way up to the presidential level. It becomes less important as you get to the higher levels, but at the congressional level, for sure, face-to-face politicking is a really important way of getting name recognition, getting people energized, and getting them to the polls. This particular election cycle, the Republican Party didn't forego any of these traditional face-to-face tools, and the Democratic Party, for reasons of the pandemic and social distancing and public health reasons, did forego these. And it showed. There is already in some of the sort of insider baseball chatter about why the Democrats lost seats in the House of Representatives and why they didn't do as well as it was possibly expected they would do in the Senate, is that they essentially gave themselves a disadvantage. Now, they almost couldn't not give themselves that disadvantage given how strongly their national messaging was, what the top of the ticket, Joe Biden, what his messaging was, how he conducted his campaign. I point this out because this is, I think, the reason why Democrats are less nervous than they might otherwise be about 2022, because in 2022, presumably, neither party is going to have to give up this particular extremely important tool of energizing their people. While it is often harder in the midterm election to energize the party that controls the presidency, because the typical dynamic is that you vote for somebody for president and they can't follow through on all the things that you voted for them for. You don't get Medicare for all or a public option. You don't get a Green New Deal. You don't get whatever it was that brought you to vote for them. And that sort of disappointment, and then the energy of the opposition, and then Americans' predilection for kind of having divided government, even though it's not necessarily the most rational predilection, it is kind of built into our political culture. Those factors all tend to work in the direction of a loss of seats in that first midterm election. That will all play out for sure in 2022 as well, but when Democrats can and will engage in more face-to-face campaigning activities, that's going to mitigate against that being the kind of bloodbath that we could otherwise expect it to be following a negative coattails presidential victory into the first midterm election. I think that another thing that will happen in 2022 is that the Democratic Party will, I think, try to press the messaging that unified government is actually a good thing, and that it's the divided government that is preventing the federal government from proactively taking steps to solve problems, from climate change to healthcare to the pandemic to the recession. And one of the things that the Democrats will have in their sort of rhetorical tool chest is the ability to point to Republican obstruction of the Democratic agenda in this direction that will help them to energize their base, and will help them also to potentially sway the moderate independent swing voters who are going to decide a lot of these swing seats. And the reason why the Democratic Party will have that rhetorical tool is because the Republican Party is almost certainly likely to try to do as much as possible to arrest progress on the Biden administration's successes and the Democratic Party's agenda, because that's what you do when you're in the minority. You attempt to block, one, because you don't believe in the policies that the other side has, and so of course you don't want them to win, and two, because you understand the basic dynamic of American politics. The pendulum has to do with disappointment and a referendum on the ins. And so if you can hobble the in party and make them seem ineffectual, voters will turn against them just because they're disappointed. So creating disappointment among voters is what the minority party tries to do. They also, of course, as I say, they just try to play defense because there are policies that they don't want. They don't. The Republican Party doesn't want more regulation. They don't want more money spent on climate change initiatives. They don't want tax increases on corporations or on wealthier people. They don't want greater regulation of the financial industry. And so they're going to play defense on that anyway. And they're going to do what they can. And with a very narrow margin in the House, and not possibly the narrowest of margins, 50 plus the vice president in the Senate, it's going to be much easier for the Republican Party to play defense. And what they're going to be doing then is the Republican Party looking towards the 2020 elections and trying to create the standard dynamic of the midterm bloodbath for the party that has the presidency. So they're going to do what has worked in the past, and obstruction is going to work. The rhetorical things I think you can expect from Republicans is a return to fiscal responsibility. This always happens when there's a Democratic president anyway, that Republicans in Congress find their fiscal responsibility and they start waving that flag. We can't go into debt more and more. The Republicans are very good at going into debt when they're in control for their own priorities, usually for military spending, or for benefiting by cutting taxes to benefit wealthier people and businesses. They tend to refine their fiscal conservatism when there's a Democrat in the White House or when there's Democratic control over one or both houses of Congress. So that, I think, is what we can expect. And that speaks to the reason why they do that, and continuously, despite the fact that it's a pattern and it looks hypocritical and it seems ridiculous that it works every time. It works every time. And that, so far, it's worked every time. It doesn't mean it will continue to work in the future, but I don't see any changes that are going to make that particular playbook not work. So Republicans are going to use their standard playbook that they use when they're in the minority. And if there are major legislative achievements of the Democratic Party, if there is Democrats control the Senate and Biden is able to use his skill, he has a lot of experience in the legislative branch, use his skill and his political capital to get one or two major pieces of legislation passed, that will then actually work for the Republicans because that'll give them something to run against. It really was in almost, there were other factors, but the Affordable Care Act, which was a tremendous success for the Democratic Party's platform, it was a tremendous success for President Obama, it was a tremendous success for a lot of Americans, that gave the Republicans something to run against. And they've been running against it ever since, very successfully. So to the extent that the Republican Party fails to block every major initiative, if they do fail, that is going to help their prospects in the 2022 elections. Now, one thing to note about the 2022 elections is that, of course, there's House elections where all 435 members are up for election. Now, they will be running in new districts because the redistricting process will be complete by the 2022 elections. And so some members of Congress will actually be running in districts that look different demographically and politically than the ones they ran in before. And some people will have been moved from safe seats to swing seats, and some people will have been moved from swing seats to safe seats. If it's possible, two safe people will have been moved into the same safe district. This is one of the very sleazy type of gerrymandering moves where, let's say that you're the Democratic Party has control over the state legislature in a state, and there are two safe Republican seats in adjacent districts. You can combine those two in one so that basically they have to run against each other. Typically, Republicans have had an easier time doing that to Democrats because Democrats' districts are more densely packed and usually more adjacent in urban areas. But as I said in the previous lecture, we shouldn't expect to see too much difference in the number of safe and swing seats, particularly at the federal level. So House elections are likely to look in 2022 like we expect them to in terms of the districts and the number of safe seats and swing seats. The seats that swung to the Democratic Party in 2018 and back to the Republican Party in 2020 are absolutely going to be up for play. All of those suburban districts are going to be up for play, and there really is going to be. I mean, there's more than a decent chance that Republicans will take control of the House. They cut into the Democratic majority this election cycle, obliterating the coattail effect, and so it could be that they're able to take more gains. But what their victories this time mean is that the next set of gains is going to be harder. They picked up the easier of the swing seats in this particular election cycle. And as I say, there was a kind of a turnout mechanism disparity that the Democratic Party gave up on face-to-face campaigning, and they won't do that in the next cycle. In terms of the Senate, the 2022 Senate elections, there are 12 Democratic incumbents who will be running for re-election and 22 Republican incumbents running for re-election. With that kind of disparity, that almost always means that the party that's defending more seats, it has a bigger battle, has a harder time because one, there's just more chances for flips. Two, it means that money has to be distributed more widely, right? You would rather be defending 12 seats than 22 seats for sure, just in terms of the national donor pool. the Republicans have 3 retiring senators in Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And Wisconsin and Pennsylvania are definitely swing states that are kind of going back and forth. They're being battled for back and forth. North Carolina has been for a while a reliably Republican state, but it is trending very much in the in the swing direction. So there's already 3 seats where there are retirements. It's always harder for a party to defend a Senate seat that's open than it is to defend a Senate seat with an incumbent in place, because of all the advantages of the incumbency, name recognition, donor networks, endorsements, their ability to have delivered victories to the constituents in the state. So already that's going to make it more challenging. Now, that is a midterm election, and so the Republican voters are much more likely to be motivated to come out to, one, protect their Senate Republicans, to get back the Senate majority if they, in fact, lose it in Georgia, or to defend their Senate majority if they maintain it. Democrats are, again, likely to be more, their turnout is likely to be lower, but they have more targets because they're going to have fewer seats to have to defend. So the Senate map is, and it's impossible to predict what the Senate map is going to look like because we don't really know right now which of the sort of marginal places, like Senator Rob Portman in Ohio is running for re-election. By a year from now, we'll be able to know whether that's a rocky one for the Republicans to defend or whether that's still actually pretty solid. Donald Trump did win that state pretty handily this time. Ohio is trending more strongly red than in the past when it was much more of a swing state. So the specific number of seats that are up in the air will depend, and it will really depend on the economy, right? If the economy is doing poorly or doing well. It will depend on the Democrats' legislative successes or lack of legislative successes. But it is potentially a more challenging map for the Republican Party than for the Democratic Party. That will change again, and that's one of the things. And the reason why it's a more challenging map for Republicans is because in 2022 they're defending seats that they won in 2016, which was a victorious year for the Republican Party. The reason why 2020 was a challenging map is because 2014, as the final midterm election of Obama's presidency, was a big year for Republicans. So these kinds of things happen in these sorts of cycles, that when you have a good cycle, 6 years later, it means you have more seats to defend. Now that's a happy problem in a way, right? Because the more seats you have to defend, that meant for 6 years you had those seats for your party and for your ability to either advance your legislative agenda or block the other side from advancing their agenda. So these are kind of the things. So I'm definitely not making any predictions about what the 2022 elections are going to look like, just talking about what it is that will be happening. Now, there's going to be even more outside money in the 2022 midterm elections than in the 2018 midterm elections. The trend, the post-Citizens United trend of more and more outside money being spent in each election cycle is undoubtedly going to hold up. There's almost certainly going to be no major election law coming out of Congress that's going to prohibit that kind of money from being spent. So what we will also see in 2022 is very ideologically heightened campaigns. And that, I think, is just that's a trend that's going to continue until there's some kind of legislation or court rulings that are going to prevent this outside money from having an increasingly large impact on our election cycles. And certainly with the way the Supreme Court looks right now, and with the difficulty that it would be for the Democratic Party to one, prioritize and push through some kind of national campaign finance and campaign reform law, that we're going to have a continuation of this trend. And so we will see a lot of ideological battling in the 2022 election. There will be, of course, candidates who want to position themselves as compromisers and problem solvers and pragmatic people who are going to go to Washington and work and try to serve their constituents by solving America's problems. But that is going to be a less winning type of strategy. That type of strategy used to win. That type of strategy doesn't win very much anymore. In fact, it's kind of a dying breed. Now, the 2024 presidential election is going to be an interesting one, and there are a number of X factors. One X factor, of course, is Donald Trump going to run in 2024? If he does, and the Republican Party wants to stop him from getting the nomination, will they be able to stop him? Now, one of the things about that is they may not even want to stop him. if he continues to have the kind of support that of 70 plus million Americans, and the sort of energetic turnout and the down ballot voting to support Republicans, if that's going to happen, then Republicans might actually again want Trump to be their nominee this time, as opposed to last time when most of them didn't. They now have seen what it does for them. And what it does for them is it gives them the potential of taking back the White House after only 4 years and getting all of those tools of power back in the hands of the Republican Party. So any executive orders could be flipped once again. Any re-regulations can be flipped once again into deregulation. Any of the many levers of power that the executive branch exercises, the Republican leadership would, of course, rather have that in the hands of any Republican president rather than in the hands of any Democratic president. So but the question is, will Trump's support have that kind of legs? Because one of the things that is certainly possible, and this is one of the potential consequences of Trump's scorched earth approach to the 2020 election, is that if he's able to actually leave office casting significant doubt about the integrity of our electoral system, about the health of the American democratic system at large, that could be dispiriting to many of his supporters, and they could just disappear back into the ranks of the non-voters and into the ranks of the apathetic and the unpolitically engaged. And that would mean the Republican Party would have to look for another way to energize their base and or get those people back into the voting booth. Now, it's also possible that Trump will just decide that the Republican Party hasn't been sycophantic enough, and he'll start his own party and run a kind of a vanity third-party campaign in 2024. That is certainly possible. That would actually be, from the point of view of his entertainment ethic, that would be maybe even the best, starting the Trump party and running himself for re-election as a third-party candidate. And if he did that, that would be historically interesting. That would definitely be commented on for decades and decades, in the future in terms of American politics. So is Trump going to be running? Is he going to be a force? Is he going to be healthy enough? All of the question marks around Trump's campaign, or Trump's potential 2024 campaign, that will take a couple of years for us to really be able to figure that out. The other question mark is, will Joe Biden run again? Will he decide that he's done his healing job and he wants to pass the baton, as he said he wants to do, to the younger generation of the Democratic Party, and actually decide to go the James K. Polk route and to not run for re-election, to try to keep his promises in one term and get out? And he's also very old, and so it could be that he may not even have very much of a choice. It's possible that he'll die in office. I think it's unlikely that he will die in office. So the other question is, will we see a Democratic incumbent? And then, of course, all the standard questions of, if there's a Democratic incumbent, what's the economy look like? How dispirited are Democrats? How energized are Republicans? I think that one of the things is, if we do have a Joe Biden running for re-election in 2024, one of the things that will help his messaging is that it will be clear by that point that a vote for Joe Biden is not a vote for a lurch into socialism. It's not a vote for defunding the police or for turning over power to anarchists and progressives. Joe Biden will do he will have to do some placating of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but it will be clear to most moderate American voters that Joe Biden isn't the scary socialist in an old white guy's costume that the Republicans tried to paint him as, this time unsuccessfully, and it will be even harder to do it next time. He will come across as a moderate, as a healer, as a pragmatist, if he in fact runs. Now, if the country's doing well in 2024, that always gives an advantage to the incumbent. If the country's doing poorly in 2024, there's still an incumbency advantage, but it's going to make it much harder. And if the country's doing poorly and Trump is actually on the Republican ticket in 2024, running against Biden for a rematch, I would say it's up in the air. It's a coin flip from the perspective of right now. Now, that's too much speculating down the road, but what I'm doing is I'm kind of trying to give you a perspective on what it is that, how it is our electoral system in terms of the party's participation and in terms of the dynamics and factors that play into future election wins and losses. One of the things the Republican Party will definitely try to do very strongly over the next 4 years is portray, if they decide to drop the whole like this election was stolen from Trump, they're going to portray it as really close, even though in terms of the Electoral College vote, it actually wasn't that close, and in terms of the popular vote, it definitely wasn't that close. But there are ways to that media narrative that the Republicans are going to want, that it was a really close election, the ground is already laid there. The Democratic Party, of course, is going to want to, and this is what the winning party always does. Donald Trump did the same thing. He won a decent electoral majority, though not a huge one, never as big as what Barack Obama won, and he won it with 75,000 votes in 3 key states. He portrayed it as a huge victory. Democrats are going to try to do that as well. They have a harder time, I think, this particular time doing it, not only because Trump and the Republicans are portraying this as a stolen election, but because the way the media has covered this election is that it's been razor thin and really close. And it's, in the end, the states that Biden flipped, he will have flipped them by several 100,000 votes. So he will have done way better than Donald Trump did in 2016 in terms of not only the popular vote, which Trump didn't win in 2016 and Biden did, but in terms of the vote margins in the critical mass states. Even though he only ended up winning the exact same number of electoral votes that Donald Trump won. So both parties are going to try to create that kind of narrative. I definitely can't predict which side is going to be more successful with that narrative. If I had to bet, I would bet that the Republicans are going to be more successful at getting their narrative adopted, if only because they have momentum for that narrative, and also they tend to be better than the Democratic Party at sustaining a beneficial narrative about American politics. All right, well, that is the end of the final lecture for this class, and there it is. I guess I have nothing else to say.